Fantastic. Thank you so much, Linda. And I'd like to just briefly introduce myself. So my name is Stewart Utley. I'm a learning designer with University of Cambridge online. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it in person today, but I think that's kind of the beauty of this conference and as a distance conference, kind of practicing what it preaches as it sits within the Centre for Online and Distance Education. So thank you so much for inviting me today. I'm going to be talking about authentic assessment and specifically with the use case of short form online courses. At the University of Cambridge Online, we create predominantly online courses, asynchronous, but with live sessions. And we're kind of tapping into the expertise of Cambridge academics and basically bringing their insights and their theory to life and applying it to professional contexts. So predominantly professional learners kind of going through, they're looking at our courses as a way to either kind of move into a slightly different area of their work and their business, but also perhaps kind of shift their trajectory in terms of the things that they want to do and apply themselves professionally. So I'll quickly kind of introduce you to a bit of the running order in terms of what we're looking at today. So I'll give a bit of an overview of kind of authentic assessment in terms of a little bit of history of where authentic assessment came from, why it kind of came into the foreground as an approach for assessing within higher education and further education, and also kind of talk about why did authentic assessment come to this foreground, and why is it kind of valuable in the things that we do? I'll introduce the microbiome research design course and talk about kind of the design challenge for that and introduce why we kind of wanted to utilize authentic assessment, but had to think about how we were actually delivering that. We also, from that, kind of identified these ways that helped us leverage authenticity in assessment, whilst also considering the kind of constraints of the delivery model. So the three kind of elements of that were authenticity as a spectrum, so thinking about authenticity not as a kind of binary option, but actually a spectrum that sits on multiple dimensions, and how do we leverage that to create something that reflects the kind of course delivery, but also is meaningful assessment for learners in terms of what they want to do and what they take away from the course. This notion of kind of future authentic and how it shapes the microbiome research design course, and then kind of these practical lessons in terms of things that might be useful to take away to kind of evaluate where authenticity might sit within assessment within the types of courses that you create. So in terms of the role of authenticity, it very much kind of came with this idea of mirroring real world tasks in response to some criticisms that higher education wasn't preparing learners properly for kind of graduation and professional life. And it really rose to prominence in the 1990s as almost a kind of critique of this notion of decontextualized testing and that we weren't preparing learners for this future. Very much rooted in kind of constructivist theory, so thinking about assessment as learning and situating learners within assessment as kind of purposeful doing. It's framed in terms of the benefits of looking at increasing motivation, relevance, and knowledge transfer, and has a lot of roots in professional vocational education. But now we're seeing it kind of spread more widely within higher education. We're trying to kind of reduce the gap between the transfer between graduating in higher education and how that's actually applied in a myriad of professional contexts. So our kind of course that we were looking at here is we designed a course with an academic at Cambridge. So this was in partnership with the Dr. Virginia Petticord of Petticord Lab at Cambridge. And the kind of problem to solve that this course came up with was gut microbiome research is evolving faster than training provision can keep up. And it's leaving very busy professionals without kind of flexible practical resources to build these key skills. So what we found is that the microbiome research kind of field in recent years has grown in prominence, and it's becoming more recognized that studying the gut microbiome and including it in clinical trials or research is actually a key puzzle piece that's missing. But because of how recent these advances were, it's difficult to keep up and put this within kind of more traditional educational pathways, but also to create kind of these flexible courses that might support professionals who are working with and need to implement these things immediately. So the audience was primarily kind of researchers across medical and biopharma fields, clinicians, postgrads, pharmaceutical professionals, and also clinical fund managers. So those who are actually receiving these proposals need to be able to kind of critically evaluate them and make sure that everything has kind of the logic behind it and the sense making that aligns with best practices within the field. So in terms of us trying to address this problem to solve, the duration on the course was 4 weeks, 4 to 5 hours a week within a 1 hour live session with Dr. Virginia and a postgrad who worked within our lab, who acted as the tutor. So very much having access to an academic who is directly working in this field, but also considering that it's a 4 week course, it's modular, it's delivered 4 times a year, and can therefore be studied whilst, if medical students are currently engaging within their traditional study pathway, but also for those who are actually working in the field, it's something that's quite modular that can easily within 4 weeks kind of tap into this notion and then be applied to their work. So this was our kind of design challenge. So how do we design an assessment that is both professionally meaningful and practically achievable for time-poor learners within the delivery of the course, which is a 4 week online course? And we kind of developed 3 guiding principles from this. So one is revisiting authenticity and viewing it more as a spectrum rather than this kind of binary option. Considering the assessment output and product as something we've kind of claimed as a MVPA. So this is minimal viable professional artifact, and then actually kind of working from there to see where it sits within the course and how that can then develop into a meaningful project post-course. And then kind of aligned with that is this notion of looking at assessment as a future authentic approach. How do we actually do something in the immediate that can then be taken further into a wider course into a wider context after the course finishes in order to provide a meaningful artifact that can actually bloom in the real world and turn into a real research project or a real meaningful project that learners can apply and has immediate impact on their professional working lives. So this first notion was actually revisiting authenticity, which often within the literature has been kind of stated as the main component of authenticity or authentic assessment is this notion of realism. But actually, when you kind of dig a little bit deeper, it's often kind of attributed as a bit of a binary approach. Either an assessment is authentic or it isn't. And actually, research or literature has kind of unpacked this a little bit and stated that we kind of need to reposition our thinking on authenticity as something that's more of a spectrum rather than actually this binary option. And through viewing it as a spectrum, we can start to think about the elements of authenticity that we want to include in the assessments rather than, trying to necessarily mimic something that is being applied in the real world or the professional world. So kind of taking it from this notion of spectrum, we actually then elevate that to the point of it's a spectrum, but it's also a spectrum across dimensions. When we consider authenticity, we're not just thinking about an output or a product, we're also thinking about, okay, well, what was the problem that sparked this project? What are the connections that learners are making kind of within the course and within the course tutors? How authentic are they? What is the output? Is that an authentic output that they utilize? What are the roles and processes, and where do they sit perhaps with other people or the things that they're doing that represent authenticity? And who is the audience? Who is receiving this or grading this or evaluating this or providing commentary on that? Where does that kind of sit on the authenticity line? And so, of course, with the spectrum, these aren't kind of definitive percentages that we find within these 5 levels, but there's an opportunity for us to kind of review and look at the assessment approach for this course and consider, okay, across these different dimensions, what is most relevant for what the learners need to do? And for us, we wanted them to bring their own problem to the course and use the course as a bit of an accelerator to explore that problem. In terms of the connections, they were amongst other professional audiences, so they could leverage those, and we kind of scaffolded that into the course approach is how do they leverage the expertise of others who also, we have to recognize, are also novices in this particular approach or application of microbiome research, but they all come with their own professional expertise. Thinking about the product, what is their actual output and how aligned is that to the sorts of things that they would need to create in the real world, the roles and processes involved, and also the audiences. For us, the graders were postgrad students working in labs. So how real is the audience who are receiving this and looking at this work? So once we kind of looked at revisiting authenticity as a spectrum, we then kind of worked on thinking about an MVPA. So this notion of what is the kind of minimal viable professional artifact that this course can look to create, but can be reduced enough to its kind of most meaningful components. And so what we did was we kind of identified the professional artifact. So in this case, it was actually a full research proposal. We realized that actually the learners didn't need to do the tests or the studies. They just needed to be able to design what that looked like and then turn that into a way that they can communicate that to stakeholders. So we identified the professional artifact as a research proposal, and that would align with kind of what the problem to solve for the course was. We stripped that to its kind of minimal viable form. So we kind of looked at what are the core elements of that are actually required to evidence what we're trying to achieve within this course. What are the non-negotiable components that we want to maintain? We then kind of aligned our module flow to scaffold this. So we allowed the modules to kind of build on one another. So we kind of worked from a hypothesis to design to method to analysis plan, and then worked with that iteratively to also represent how learners would be working with that in professional settings. And then also a key part was communicating its leverage. So this is tapping into something that I'll talk about in a moment, which is this future authentic. Perhaps actually the product that we create now wouldn't exist in its authentic place within professional context now, but it could be something that could be built on and leveraged and turned into a real authentic product in the future. So this notion of future authentic is very much kind of this notion of it doesn't have to necessarily replicate professional practice, but it can be anticipating what the practice the learner will engage with in the future. So this product doesn't need to necessarily represent a full-blown proposal or research proposal now, but needs to contain the core elements that can then be developed after the course, and we need to communicate this to learners as well. So it legitimizes assessment that prepares rather than immediately kind of replicates the product. It shifts this focus of, will this be build the capabilities needed over, does this replicate the current practice? It's particularly relevant in fast-moving fields. So, for example, microbiome science, things are shifting. So what we needed to teach was the underpinning decision-making skills that would then create this artifact. And then it also kind of gave us permission to design towards the learner's anticipated professional trajectory. So it gave them the option to choose in which direction they wanted to take their project, and knowing that they could then elevate that further after the course finished in their professional context. So what this looked like was a 900-word proposal, which was a research proposal. They all came with their kind of a problem to solve, where they wanted to either incorporate analysis of the microbiome for perhaps looking into how that can modulate the impact of a drug, or maybe they were looking at a particular disease or phenotype that they wanted to integrate an analysis of the microbiome to see if it had any impact on kind of the outcomes for that. So they brought this in module one was very much about kind of giving them a foundation and developing a hypothesis, which they were then to develop over the series of the course. Module two was about them kind of actually unpicking what they wanted to look at and develop the study design and the aims. They then built the characterization methods in module three, and then finally looked at making choices. How would they analyze the data once they've characterized that and received back the output of their module three? So what we basically did is we created this kind of iterative approach, which very much reflected and replicated the iterative approaches we often find with creating an artifact such as a research proposal. And we scaffolded the focus of the modules in order for them to create this. We also leveraged peer support. So each week they showed their current iteration of the proposal and introduced reviews, so learners kind of engaging and providing insights and developments on what that could look like. And then this kind of provision of an early submission also signaled the purpose from week one. They knew exactly what they were creating by the end of the course, and actually the course acted as a bit of an accelerator for developing these proposals. Also considering their time, it avoided this kind of big bang problem of putting a huge summative assessment at the end. They were developing throughout the course, and this kind of iterative approach, again, as I said, kind of replicates the approach that would be created during professional applications and creation of these research proposals. So the learner feedback that we got from this was really positive, and a key kind of theme that really stuck out was the ability to link the course content to the professional requirements, and the assessment really was a catalyst for this. So kind of the ideas that the notions that we received back from learners was it's really relevant to their work. They've kind of reflected on their ability to align research questions with all of these different elements which they were struggling previously. There's an increasing confidence in being able to actually plan these research proposals. Again, there's also kind of links to appreciation of how the realism of the assessment, even though it didn't fully replicate an entire research proposal, even at its kind of minimal viable artifact level, we're still able to enact this notion of realism, which is really, really great to see in terms of the feedback. And again, linked with kind of practical decision making in their study design. So we also had a lot of feedback that these were projects that were then taken after the course and developed into actual fund and grant applications, which was great to hear. So the key takeaways that we have here are kind of, when looking at authenticity within assessment, trying to view it as spectrum across dimensions and thinking about which one we can leverage and which one is most appropriate to the learning outcomes that we're trying to achieve within that particular course. Identifying the MVPA, so the minimal viable professional artifacts, and thinking about how that aligns with kind of learning outcome needs. So how can you take an artifact and then really break it down to its leanest form to then align with learning outcomes as a way of, a catalyst for driving those learning outcomes and giving that sense of purpose and direction at the start of a course. And then also leveraging this notion of future authentic. So presenting this product or assessment to learners as, okay, once you actually complete the course and post-course, this is something that you can take forward and is actually the fundamentals and foundation of a full-blown research proposal that you can then take forward and use in real-world applications. So kind of allowing ourselves to communicate that to learners that we can drive forward this product and actually elevate that post-course as not only just mimicking a product from the real world, but actually the fundamentals and foundations of it, which then can then be taken forward. So those are the kind of key takeaways in terms of how we try to look at authenticity within this course, and some things that I would recommend addressing or looking at if you're thinking about where authenticity can sit within particular delivery models, especially those that are online or asynchronous and may not necessarily always have the same conditions as kind of situated professional learning. And a bunch of references there. I'm sure that the presentation is available for download as well, so feel free to download that and go through the references.